Welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started with this 45-minute session on how you can deliver better experiences using SharePoint Patterns and Practices, specifically a new project called Community Solutions. Now, I'm Mike Amerlon. I work on the Office Ecosystem Marketing team, but in a previous life, I actually worked on the SharePoint product. I worked a lot on the developer ecosystem, so a lot of the components, things like features and web parts, sort of ASP.NET web parts, those are some of the things I worked on, but now I actually work on trying to make it easier for you to discover how you can actually use SharePoint to build applications. So in this session, what we're going to do is talk about the landscape of building business applications on top of SharePoint. We're going to sort of back up and take like this high-level view of the kinds of scenarios that we think people will be developing on top of SharePoint, what we think SharePoint is really good for, and how you can actually specifically build a different type of application, a business application, on top of SharePoint, and leverage all the things that will make your life easier as developers, as solution providers using SharePoint. So we'll get a little bit of a high-level view of the SharePoint developer landscape. But then next up, what I want to do is I want to talk about some common patterns that we see when people build applications on top of SharePoint. Making the best of working in SharePoint, leveraging all of the capabilities it has, we find that there's a lot of specific patterns that people use, special tricks or one simple trick to build a better business application on top of SharePoint. So what we're going to do is show you some of these patterns by way of a few set of solutions that we've built. This is called SharePoint Community Solutions. It's available as part of our Patterns and Practices set of libraries, which we'll talk about. But the great news about this is that all of the things that you see here, all of the code that you see here, it's available for you to download. We have a Patterns and Practices repository, and better yet, if you want to submit your own samples, your own patterns, you can do that as well, and we'll find out a little bit about how to do that. So end-to-end, what you'll come away with is sort of a review of the SharePoint business application landscape, coupled with a set of just developer techniques and some code that you'll see for building modern solutions on top of SharePoint. So I hope you'll feel inspired to build your next application using everything that's available inside of SharePoint to get that much more quickly to market and help your customers out. Okay, so this is a little bit of the Office 365 platform. Of course, we're all here to learn about SharePoint, but SharePoint is just one of many components inside of Office 365. And increasingly, you can actually mix and match different components together to build really powerful applications. Of course, I'm sure you've heard all about Microsoft Graph. It's this unified API that we have for accessing data in SharePoint, but also inside of Outlook and also inside of Teams across all different types of applications. Coupled with the ability to call into Microsoft Graph APIs that you may have heard about earlier today. There was a session from Luca Bandinelli and Paolo Pelorsi that talked about this. You can actually access the Microsoft Graph inside of SharePoint applications so that you can build this web part or experience inside of SharePoint that pulls things like groups and reports all in one place so you can build a really powerful set of parts. Of course, you can host these things called web parts inside of Pages. Hopefully you're familiar with those. But across Office, whether you're talking about Microsoft Teams or Microsoft Word, there are similar ways to build web experiences that work inside of Office applications. But for today, we are going to focus on the page experience and specifically SharePoint. Okay, so let's talk about some of the scenarios that we see people building with SharePoint. A little while ago, like let's say in 2007 when I was doing some of the developer features, this was pre-cloud to a large extent. And so one of the things that people would do with SharePoint is they would see it as this sort of Swiss Army knife platform because to some extent, SharePoint was kind of like a cloud before there was a cloud. It was this ubiquitous infrastructure that was deployed to companies. And as a developer, if your company had already deployed SharePoint, it was this reliable infrastructure that you could deploy to, and you wouldn't have to worry about hosting your own application, running your own IIS server, all that kind of fun stuff. You had SharePoint, it had some capabilities, and you could go use it. So people built a lot of different types of applications on top of SharePoint. Sometimes they really push SharePoint to its limits. Of course, these days we have, of course, a number of different options. Azure has so many different new facilities. There's great capabilities for building web applications. There's Azure Functions for building web services. There's web jobs for building timers. So there's a lot of capabilities inside of Azure. When we think about SharePoint, though, we still do see a lot of different compelling things that you can build on top of SharePoint. Starting with this concept of site experiences. SharePoint is the host of portal pages, team sites, those kinds of things that represent really the face and the home of a lot of teams inside the company. Whether it's a team that has a bunch of dashboards and some charts for measuring their work, whether it's a department that has a communication site, communicating out department news, or whether it's the portal for the entire organization. What key scenarios for SharePoint is to build out those site experiences. And as a developer, you, of course, are going to want to extend that, and you can go ahead and do that. Here you see a product from a company called Powell 365 that also builds tools to make it easier to build streamlined sites on top of SharePoint as well. SharePoint, as I mentioned, is frequently this hub. It's the thing that maybe people boot up multiple times a day to see what's going on in their team. So commonly, people want to bring in the tools that they use inside of SharePoint. So for example, what you can maybe see here, maybe pick it out a little bit, is DocuSign, for example. DocuSign is a document signing service. SharePoint has a lot of documents in it, so it's natural that they're going to want to extend the document library experience to add some custom commands for signing documents. And so as a developer, you can bring any kinds of tools that you want, especially those that work with documents. You can integrate them into SharePoint. You can build applications that basically use SharePoint as your launch pad for going into your custom tools. Of course, there's a full API suite as well, so if you want to build tools behind the scenes that connect to SharePoint, that pull out documents, that do things with them, you can build those as well. Now, SharePoint is the home to a lot of the content inside of an organization, the documents, the PowerPoints, all the different spreadsheets and models, the yearly financials, all those kinds of things. So, of course, we see a lot of companies that want to have a very tightly controlled process or workflow on top of the documents that sit inside of SharePoint. So frequently, people will customize the processes and workflows quite considerably. So that's a very natural thing. There's, of course, a lot of third-party software for doing processes and workflows. But of course, there's also tools like Flow and Addition for different types of needs. And you can really customize how documents are represented inside of SharePoint. The final thing is what we're going to focus on today, this concept of business applications. This is really, if you think about the teams and the departments in your organization, they're always going to have these custom productivity needs. Maybe they need just a one-off tool for tracking inventory, or maybe they need a way to have a set of change requests, things that come into a queue that they want to manage and triage. Or maybe they just want a very simple out-of-office vacation calendar on top of their SharePoint page. To support this, of course, there's a lot of products for doing those things, and those are all great choices, but sometimes it might make sense to build that application on top of SharePoint. And so for the rest of this session, we'll talk a little bit about why you would want to build an application on SharePoint, and we'll talk through a few examples. So why would you want to build an application on SharePoint? I love building on Azure. Azure is very, very powerful. It's very clean. There's a lot of, simplicity. There's new things coming inside of Azure all the time. But SharePoint, for some certain types of applications, actually can be a really compelling choice for building applications as well. It comes with the infrastructure everyone needs. It can be tailored very easily by teams. It has a set of rich APIs and a developer experience. And it's hosted on the trusted cloud that's available everywhere. So let's talk about those. First, SharePoint comes with a whole bunch of different building blocks that you can use to build your application. It's ready to run and available for you. So let's talk about lists, for example. Lists exist in SharePoint. They're kind of like miniature database tables to some extent. They have a schema. They have different types. There's single text fields. There's number fields. There's lookups. You can even implement sort of almost miniature relational applications. Not quite relational, but somewhat relational, as we'll see. Lists that work together to really serve as the data store for your application. Now, why would you want to use a SharePoint list when you can actually use a SharePoint table or a database table? Well, because SharePoint lists come with a lot of good things. They come with a user experience. So, if you want to provide a tool for letting people edit items inside your list, you can just point them at the SharePoint list user experience, and then they can go ahead and edit them. I've built applications where sometimes my user experience had bugs in it, or it didn't have quite the view that somebody wanted of those list items. My application wasn't doing quite enough, and so I could just point them at the SharePoint list UI and say, okay, well, but here you can go build your own user experience, you can build your own custom view. And so as a developer, it was a nice insurance policy to some extent that there's always a backing user experience, there's always a backing way for people to get at the data, even if I was building an application on top of it. Of course, SharePoint has really great document functionality, so if your application is very connected to documents, you get a lot of things, quote unquote, for free, things like check-in, check-out, versioning, all kinds of document capabilities all available inside of SharePoint. SharePoint has security, right? So there is a security management user experience inside of SharePoint that if you build your application on SharePoint, chances are you may not actually have to go build your own security experience. And SharePoint, of course, has a lot of bells and whistles for managing different types of security configurations. Sometimes it can be a little, not well targeted to your scenario, so you may want to build an experience, but again, you can rely on the fact that there's actually something behind the scenes for managing the security of SharePoint. Another good example is export to Excel. If you have data inside of your SharePoint lists, again, a lot of times people will say, your application doesn't do X or Y or Z, or I really just want to do some data analysis. And ordinarily, as an application developer, if you're building this on Azure, you'd probably do something like say, okay, well, I guess I just need to go build some sort of dump feature, sort of dump it out to an Excel file, maybe it'll be CSV. Well, if you're building your application on SharePoint lists, you already have that capability. You can export a SharePoint list into Excel. It's connected behind the scenes, and then people can slice and dice and pivot and do whatever they want, build their own custom visualizations as well. So, lots of things like that. Just one more I'll mention from this list. A recycle bin, right? When you're building an application, you're gonna probably need a delete button somewhere, right? And people are gonna use that delete button, and sometimes they're gonna mistakenly use that delete button. The cool thing about SharePoint, again, building your application on SharePoint lists, is you have a recycle bin. So if somebody deletes something and you need to get it back, you can just go to the SharePoint recycle bin and restore it. And so therefore, you have this built-in safety net underneath your application because there's a recycle bin capability built inside. Of course, SharePoint has an emerging set of rich APIs and tools. So if you haven't been really following the SharePoint developer ecosystem in the past year and a half, there's been a tremendous amount of progress on making it more connected and more easy to build on top of using modern developer tools. So Microsoft Graph, as we've mentioned, is this ubiquitous API across Office 365. In the past year, we've added SharePoint Site API, so you can get at all the site data, you can get at all the file information, and of course, you can also now, as of this week, you can get at all the list data inside of SharePoint. Now, the nice thing about this for developers is that there's a set of SDKs. There's things like an iOS library, an Android library, a Xamarin library, .NET. So you can build applications like a mobile application that easily connects to SharePoint data. There's a lot of tools like Microsoft Flow and Azure Functions that you can connect to SharePoint. So those are always available if you need to extend custom business logic. And then finally, we have SharePoint Framework, which we're going to talk quite a bit about, which is this way to build client-side rich application experiences in JavaScript that connect to back-end SharePoint data. So you can use that as well. And if you're familiar with modern web development tools and frameworks, things like React or Knockout or Angular, you can use some of those tools to go build applications against SharePoint. The final thing, one other thing I'll mention is that it's tailorable. So for example, as I mentioned, you'll frequently build an application, but then you'll get a new requirement or a new thing from your users that you need to go extend with. Because it's built on SharePoint, you can actually do things like add a flow to do notifications. You can build a mobile presentation layer via Power Apps. You can also do things like update SharePoint lists to add additional metadata. So there are tools available that let end users customize your application without requiring that you, as a developer, go back and recompile your application or go extend it. It's flexible, and there's ways to expose that flexibility inside of your application so that, again, down the road, if somebody wants to build a Power App for a mobile presentation, or if somebody wants a custom workflow or custom notification system, you don't need to write new lines of code. You can actually connect that to your SharePoint lists. And then finally, the trusted cloud available everywhere. So, a lot of customers have Office 365. A lot of customers have SharePoint on premises. And between the two, you can basically be guaranteed, of course, that in a lot of cases, customers have this infrastructure that's available to them. And of course, in your own organizations, you know where your SharePoint is, almost certainly. But in Office 365, we have over 100 million monthly active commercial users. That's people across organizations, storing their documents inside of, using Office 365, a subset of which are using SharePoint. But the other really cool thing about this is that we have things like Trust Center for Office 365. So this is a set of standards like ISO 27001 and the like. It's a set of tools like, for example, compliance tools, things to discover, for legal discovery, to discover all the content that exists. So if you're storing your content inside of your application and then you store it inside of SharePoint, you get a lot of these capabilities and these benefits for you automatically, as compared to maybe running your own Azure website where you might have to figure out your own way to expose it for legal reasons for discovery. If you're hosting your data inside of SharePoint, a lot of that gets taken care of for you. All those tools will apply to your application because the data is really just stored inside of a SharePoint list or a SharePoint document library. Okay, so that sort of gives you a little bit of a landscape of why to build business applications on SharePoint. So next up, let's just talk a little bit about the developer model. This is the set of tools and technologies that are available to you. So we have a lot of technologies, as I said, in the past year and a half. We've added a number of different things. Graph APIs have gotten quite extended. We've added webhooks, which is a way inside of code to react to changes inside of SharePoint. Microsoft Flow has grown tremendously in the past year and a half. So if you want to build a workflow or simple like notification systems, you can do that with Flow, which we'll see. You can do things like use SharePoint Framework to build a user experience. And you can also use Power Apps to build things like forms or mobile Power Apps, mobile applications, excuse me, for your devices. So there's a lot of tools here. I won't go into sort of all the pros and cons here, but suffice to say that there's a lot of options for you to mix and match. Specifically, if you look at the set of tools, you're going to want to be able to choose different tools depending on your different needs. So for example, if you're building like a sort of a list-based application, but you need a custom presentation layer, and you really want to make it super custom, super tailored, you want to add lots of charts or visualizations, you can do something like use a SharePoint list, connect it to a Microsoft Flow, and that provides you a very simple and easy to create data model. And then you can use SharePoint Framework to build your very sophisticated custom user experience. So mixing and matching different technologies across your data and your logic and your user experience layers. Conversely, if you actually need something that's got a lot of sophistication to it, there's like a very complicated data model, like lists that depend on lists and tables and relationships, you can use something called Common Data Services, or CDS, as your backing underlying store. You can use a tool like Flow to actually build logic on top of it. And then maybe you can connect that into SharePoint and use something like the SharePoint user experience to push and pull items out of that common data store or edit them. So there's a lot of options for potentially mixing and matching tools together to build your application. So a lot of great reasons to build business applications, a lot of tools for developers to create them. But there is one more thing. There is one more reason why you'd want to use SharePoint for business applications. And that is you. Which is to say, the SharePoint community is really amazing and sort of super engaged in sort of helping each other out and building great integrations on top of SharePoint. So there's an effort called SharePoint Patterns and Practices. Who's heard of SharePoint Patterns and Practices? Okay, about half of you, a little over half of you. So SharePoint Patterns and Practices, it's basically this amazing community effort that we have where dozens of different MVPs and contributors, probably hundreds actually, come together and they submit some of their best practices, some of their code. They put it into GitHub repository, and then so many companies are actually taking that code and reusing it. So for example, there's this concept called Patterns and Practices Reusable Control. So this is a set of services and controls and JavaScript libraries that we have. There's been over 4.2 billion requests that have been made from people using this in production to go build different types of applications. There's over 250 samples to help you get started. So if you want to build one of these applications from scratch, you can go visit the SharePoint PnP library. Chances are you can go find an application. There's so many people who come in and actually take a lot of the source code and sort of use it from these GitHub repositories. And then finally, there's also a huge library of videos and up-to-date training from Patterns and Practices that you can use to ramp up on new technologies. So for example, this week we've launched SharePoint Framework extensions, and there's already probably a half a dozen videos of different techniques and things that you can use for that. So in fact, let me just show you this very quickly. Let's see. So if I go over here, one of the things we actually announced at this conference is, let me just back up. So this is the GitHub repository for SharePoint Patterns and Practices. It's at github.com/SharePoint. You can see here that SharePoint Framework extensions, this new thing that we announced this week to allow you to extend custom sites. One of the things you can see is that even though this launched as a concept only 3 months ago, there's already probably 24 samples across a variety of different languages and frameworks, things like jQuery and React, that you can go download, you can go use, and hopefully inform the start of your application. So that's available for you. There's new efforts. For example, there is this new set of controls called reusable React components. React is a framework for building applications, as we'll see. And there's going to be this library of controls that you can go download and use. So for example, if you want to build an application with a breadcrumb in it or a placeholder control, you can go download this code. Of course, you're going to want to understand the code. You're going to want to probably adapt the code and really work with it and sort of use it. But this provides you a jump start for building applications. So along these lines, one of the things we wanted to do was have some of these solutions and business applications that we see people building also represented inside of the Patterns and Practices library. So there's a new effort called SharePoint Developer Solutions. So these are Patterns and Practices Community Solutions. It's a set of samples and patterns that you can go download and use. We have 4 apps to start, but in fact, we already have pull requests from a company called Shire that wants to share their applications for customizing websites. This is available for you to download and start and customize, open bugs, and sort of tailor as you see fit. Now, the other thing that these solutions do, in addition to providing great starter samples, is they also demonstrate a lot of patterns that we see when people build business applications. So let's go take a look at some of these applications. So first up, one of the applications that's exposed through this effort is something called contact management. And this does something that's very common. People want to track people. They want to track organizations. Of course, there's CRM tools that have a lot of facilities for doing that. So, if you need a CRM system, you should get a CRM system. But sometimes you need something just a little bit more lightweight. You need to track a set of organizations, and you want to have the set of people that you know from those organizations, and you want to pull it all together. And SharePoint actually ends up being a great place to represent that. So the way that this solution is actually implemented is that it uses 2 SharePoint lists, or 3 SharePoint lists, excuse me. You have a set of people, you have a set of organizations, and then there's a third list for actually representing a set of tags that you can use to actually tag organizations and people. It allows you to connect to SharePoint resources, so things like documents and images. So if you actually want to associate an image or a document with an organization, you can do that. It's also designed to be very quick to edit. So you can actually pop in, edit a contact or edit an organization, and then pop back out without too much work. And then finally, it's also extensible. So let's just take a look at what this looks like. Okay, so for this scenario, let's pretend that we actually work for an organization called Contoso Adventure. They're a travel adventure scheduling company, and so one of the things that they want to do is just manage a set of equipment. And so there's actually a number of solutions here that we'll look at. One is basically for a lending library for check-in, check-out. You can see a set of equipment that's available here that you can potentially go lend and borrow. There's an out-of-the-office planner that we'll also talk about. And then there is also a change management application for actually people opening up new change requests, getting them filed in the system, and then letting a triage team actually work through those change requests, assign them out, and get them to resolution. Now, what we're going to look at, and so these are all the solutions that are available through that Community Solutions effort. What we're going to do is take a look at that contact management application that I was talking about earlier. And what you can see here is a set of organizations that we're tracking for our equipment needs. So in this case, there's an organization called Wingtip. Wingtip actually has a bunch of fields that are available to it. If I want to go edit Wingtip and just update it really quickly, I can do that just by hitting the pencil icon. I can edit all the fields. It's great. I can do things like add tags. So in this case, if I want to say, well, maybe Wingtip supplies water equipment, or maybe it supplies food equipment or different types of things, you can actually tag it. And as an administrator, you can actually control the set of tags through a SharePoint list. You can do things like assign an owner. So if you want somebody at your company who represents an organization or maybe who knows the most about it, there's people pickers so that you can find the right person to do it. In this case, I'll just go ahead and assign them the water tag. I'll hit back. And then the other thing about this is it makes it really easy to find the right organization. So if I actually want to go ahead and search for all the organizations that supply water equipment, I'll find that there's 2 here. It's a very quick searching capability. There's also a nice ad hoc query functionality. So if I want to do something, maybe I want to find all of the organizations that we no longer work with, where status is equal to inactive. I can hit apply, and it's going to go filter down that list. So behind the scenes, it's actually using some SharePoint query facilities. It's going up against a SharePoint list. It's leveraging all those capabilities inside of SharePoint that I didn't need to go build. Now, the other cool thing about this is that it's extensible. So one of the patterns that you can actually use is you can make it possible for people to go ahead and extend these things and then bring them into your application. So we have our list of organizations here. It's stored inside of a SharePoint list. So this is the list that actually backs that application that we were just looking at. And what I can do here is I can very simply add a new field. Let's say I want to add a field called, I don't know, supplies used equipment. Maybe it's a way to track whether they supply used equipment or not versus new equipment. I just made up that example. I have no idea why. I'm going to hit save. Okay, so now when I actually go back to my application, let's go back. The way that this web part was implemented was that it's actually extensible, so that now when I go into Wingtip and I hit Edit, and I go to Miscellaneous, you can see that there's a field here called Supplies Used Equipment, and then I can say maybe some or a lot or things like that. So I can actually update this item, and so and if I come back to it, you'll see that it should retain that information as well. So this gives you an idea that you can ship this web part that connects to a backing SharePoint list and has this ability that if somebody wants to track something additional, you don't actually have to go back and recompile the application. You don't have to go redesign your schema. It's designed to be extensible. So this is just one example of a community solution. Let's take a look at the code that sits behind it. So I'm going to open this up. So this is a SharePoint Framework web part. SharePoint Framework, how many of you have heard of SharePoint Framework? Okay, a lot of you. How many have done SharePoint Framework development? Okay, a few, or maybe like a third. Okay. So SharePoint Framework is really all about letting you write client-side code that calls web services and that can have a really responsive, fast experience. So if you're a .NET developer, it may seem a little different, a little new, but I was actually just a .NET developer about a year ago. I hadn't really done a lot of modern web development. There's a lot of concepts in this that actually carry over from .NET development that make actually picking this up, even though there's a lot of new things here, really easy. And then it's really powerful because you can build very rich applications. So let's show you just, I want to show you a very basic thing about this, which is, I'm going to go into contact management, and there's a whole bunch of files here. You see these TSX files. These are basically what are called components in React. If you're familiar with .NET, if you're familiar with XAML or ASP.NET, those are like controls. Well, here they're called React components. And so the user experience of my application in most React applications is actually broken down quite a bit. And so you can see that I've got a number of controls here, or components, excuse me, for sort of my outer, this is from my outer web part, things like a component for displaying an organization, for allowing you to edit an organization, allowing you to edit a contact, those kinds of things. But what's nice about this open source library is that there's a set of item editor fields. So for doing things like editing up a lookup that comes from a SharePoint list, there's a component here that will let you sort of edit a lookup field inside of a SharePoint list. And so what this is used for is that when people add new fields into their SharePoint list, this automatically picks it up and can show an appropriate experience for it. So there's a set of reusable components here for giving you this capability for making your application flexible to list changes. It's open source. We're looking to sort of factor that out and make it more flexible. But the benefit of this is that this is code you can reuse to make applications built with SharePoint Framework that are responsive to underlying SharePoint list user experiences. So that's just one interesting pattern that you can take advantage of. Okay, let's move on to the next application. So this is just talking about the pattern, this concept of custom fields that you can add into your SharePoint list. Okay, next up, let's talk about inventory and checkouts. So you saw when I first visited that page, I had a set of pieces of equipment that people that worked for Contoso Adventure Travel could actually go and do. And so the way that this works is that you basically have two lists here. One is a set of inventory items, the set of things that you're actually tracking, and then there's a separate list in SharePoint for actually implementing the set of checkouts, the set of reservations that people have made. So let's go just take a quick look at the user experience for this. I'm going to come back to my SharePoint page, like so. Let's see. So I'm going to come back to Contoso Adventure Equipment. You can see at the top of the page, this is another SharePoint Framework part. And so I can look at a particular piece of equipment, let's say internal frame hiking backpacks, and I'm going to want to take this on an adventure that I'm going to go schedule. I can say new checkout, and I can say it's checked out by me, Mike Amerlon. I can say I'm going to check it out next week from October 2nd to October 6th. And I can say I'm going to go check out two items, two backpacks, I guess, and hit save. So now this is now checked out to me, and so you can see how this list works. Just a very simple inventory tracking tool coupled with a way to track checkouts. Something that's probably pretty common. I know in our office we've got like a device bar of all kinds of like different Android devices and iPhones, and you want to let people borrow them. This is a good tool for managing that kind of thing. And as I mentioned, under the covers, there's actually two SharePoint lists for them. So if I go to my site contents, you can see there's a change discussion, there's a checkouts list, and then there's an items list. One's the inventory, one's a set of checkouts. Now, what's really great about this is because it's actually a SharePoint list, I can actually add on new capabilities on top of that. So for example, one of the tools that we have is Microsoft Flow. So let's say I wanted to let somebody's manager know when they actually go ahead and check something out. Now, ordinarily as a developer, you'd have to write a lot of code to go figure that out. And especially if it's like a late-breaking request, that can be pretty painful. But here I can actually use Flow to build a very simple notification system. So what I'll just do is I'll go pop over to Microsoft Flow, and I'll go connect to those lists. Just showing how you can take these business applications and you can go extend them with different tools. So I'll go into Microsoft Flow. Again, if you haven't played with Microsoft Flow in the last 6 months, it's really come quite a long way to let you go do things. So I'm going to go create a new application from blank. I'm going to go say, Flow basically allows me to build very simple workflows that start with a trigger, and then I can sort of tack onto that a set of actions that will happen in response to a trigger. So I can start with a new SharePoint trigger. In this case, when a new item is created, and let me go ahead. All right, so this is going to take me to the Flow Designer. So when a new item is created, I'm going to go pick my SharePoint application. So you can see it's a little maybe hard to see. It'll automatically pop up a set of sites that I've been working with. So I'm going to choose the Adventure Equipment site. I'm going to choose a SharePoint list. So in this case, the checkouts list, so like that. So every time a new checkout is created, I want to do a few things. First, I want to actually figure out who my manager is. So to do that, step one, I'm actually going to go get my profile. And then, let me show you this part of it. I'm going to get my profile. I'm going to go get the manager. So I'm going to add another action for Office 365 users called Get Manager. Okay, so the way this works is that Get Manager action takes in a parameter. And since I already added an action called Get My Profile, I can just feed that into this particular action. So I click on that username to get the manager of. I say use the user principal name of the current person who sort of initiated this action, so the user principal name. So now I've actually loaded into this flow a set of state about me and about my manager. And then the next thing I'm going to do is basically have a very simple email action. So here I can then add a new action called Office 365 Outlook. I'm going to say send an email. And then what you can see is that I've got a set of parameters I can just fill in here. So who to send it to, I want to go send it to my manager. So I will just go add the email of my manager here. Subject, I could say, somebody check something out, like this. And then I can sort of parameterize the body of the mail as well. So I can use the item that was newly created to sort of feed this. So I can say, so quantity is one of the fields that are in that checkout list. I can say items were checked out by, and then I can go get my profile. So I can say my nickname or something like that. And so this is just a very simple notification layer that I've put on top of it. It'll automatically send to my manager. I'm going to create this called manager notifications like so. And so now I have this flow that's available to me. So now if I actually come back to my application, you'll see I'll click Site Contents, and let me go back to my home page. So now if I check something different out, in this case, let's go check out some cross-country ski sets. I'm going to do a new checkout. It's going to be checked out by me, and I'm going to check it in next week. And I'm going to say I'm going to check out 3 items, like so. I click Save. And so what this will do is it'll create a new item, which will then, in turn, go kick off that flow workflow. Now, if I come over to my manager, she's in a different web browser, so to speak. I'm going to go over to her email. So now if I go to her mail, what you should see is that flow has now fired. And so, so you can see that there's a message in her inbox that says, OK, somebody checked something out. Here's some details that came from that list item. So you can see how you can start by building a business application. You can build a very custom user presentation. And then, as the situation warrants, you can actually layer logic using tools like Flow. So another cool benefit of building on top of SharePoint. Cool. All right. So the pattern that we sort of talked about here was using Microsoft Flow as one case in point to add sort of custom logic layers as the situation fits. If you have your own workflow tools, you can use those. So there's a lot of options available for you. Okay, so let's talk about another scenario called change requests. So change requests is something that pretty much everyone has to do, right? You have something that you're doing for people, but then sometimes people want to give you feedback, or maybe something breaks, and you want, like, basically an input form so that you can manage those incoming change requests. Now, the way that this works is it's actually implemented with two SharePoint Framework web parts. One that's for the users in your organization that basically gives them an input form to submit their request. That's part one. And then the other web part is a tool for the triage team. This is a tool for the team to go manage the influx of new requests. Now, one of the things we want to do here is we want to let users go input their items, but we want to have a separate area for the people who are working on the change request to go track information. And sometimes you want to keep that separate from the users so that people can't see what you're talking about. So if you think that the person maybe the report was spurious and it didn't actually really happen, you want to type that to your colleagues, but you don't want the person who submitted the change request to necessarily see that. So to do that, therefore, there's basically two lists that are implemented inside of SharePoint to implement this. One is the change request list, and then there's a separate list for actually managing a discussion around the change request list. And so the benefit of this is that you can actually secure them differently. So let me show you what I mean by that. So I'm going to go back to my manager over here, and I'm going to go to that adventure equipment page over here, go to the home page. So she's been out on an adventure. She wants to go maybe log the fact that some of the equipment that she was working with was broken. So you can see that there's a web part on this page called new repair request. She can say, okay, canoe had a leak, like that, and there was a leak at I'm not typing very well, at the front of the canoe, like so. Click create. And so this creates a new item. Now, behind the scenes, if I'm actually on the, let's say now I'm sort of in a different, back in my other browser, so I'm in a different persona now, I'm Mike. There is a tool here for letting me, as the equipment repair team, actually go ahead and see the set of incoming requests and then start to work with them. So here I've got my triage tool. I can see all the incoming requests. Like this. Here's that canoe had a leak request. And I see all the data that my manager, Jasmine, that she put into there, that there's a leak at the front of the canoe. But there's also this special area here where I can actually do status updates. And so I can say, amongst my team, maybe this has low priority because we don't, it's just not a high priority. I can say that we're investigating. I could say, could not find leak, right? And so this is kind of information that maybe you want to sort of keep off to the side. You want to make sure that it's not necessarily right in front of Jasmine, who submitted the change request, so you can track that. And the way that this is done is, again, through two SharePoint lists. So we have a list here for the actual change request items. If I go to my site contents page, there's a change request list here, but then there's also a change discussion list here that we have in addition, where all those different discussions are held. And because it's SharePoint, and because SharePoint has some built-in security concepts, I can really just simply go to list settings here. I can go to permissions for this list. You can see that I've broken the permissions so that I can manage them more explicitly. This part, what it'll do is it'll create a custom set of permissions that I can apply to the list. And so now, if I go back to Jasmine, who's the user here, I go to her site contents. She can see that list of change requests, but she can't see the list with all the discussions in them. So she doesn't have a good way to actually see what's actually happening behind the scenes, which, transparency is always an awesome thing, but sometimes you want to have that sort of separate discussion area. So just another concept here that was built into this application, using separate SharePoint lists with separate SharePoint permissions to go ahead and support sort of different levels of permission and different roles that you might have for your application. Okay, so that's another application, and again, all the source code is available for you to go work with, like that. And then finally, let's go talk a bit about another web part here, which is just a simple vacation tracker. So this is just showing who is in the office, who is out of the office, the time away. And so we're probably all familiar with this. There's a number of different tools to do it, and in this case, it's just a very simple SharePoint web part for showing who's in the office. Let me go show you some of what that looks like. So I'm going to go come to a page, another page inside of my SharePoint site where I'm tracking the time away. And so this is time away 2. So in this case, you can see there's a whole set of, for this week, you can see that I'm out of the office, Jasmine's out of the office, and next week no one is away. Now, one of the things that this will do here is it'll use the underlying SharePoint approval features to actually have a really nice flow for doing content approvals. So in my case, I can add a new time away. Let's say I want to be out of the office all next week, like so, like this, out on vacation, like this. And the way this web part was built is that, by default, it'll create this item in an unapproved state. So I, as a manager, actually need to come to this list, to actually approve it, and it won't show up in the list of out of the offices until somebody actually goes and does so. So even though I just open a request saying I'm going to be out of the office next week, it doesn't show up yet because somebody actually needs to go ahead and approve them. And again, this uses the backing SharePoint list to implement it. So you can see that there's a, sort of this time away list here. This is kind of in a pending state, but I can use the SharePoint user experience to go ahead and, Jasmine doesn't have the permissions to approve them. Let me go over back to this user. Come back around. Okay, I'm going to go to the time away list you can see here. Like so. Okay, now I'm going to come over and approve this item. I can use the SharePoint user experience to do that, approve. I could do, you can't do this quite yet, but in a couple months of time, we've announced that you can use tools like Microsoft Flow to build, workflows around this particular field. So now that this item is actually approved, if I go back to my pages, what you'll see is that, let me go back to my pages. Excuse me. You'll see if I go to my time away list, now this web part will list that I'm out of the office next week because somebody has come along and approved it. So, even for something as simple as an out of the office calendar, you can see how this application can benefit, again, from all the out-of-the-box capabilities of SharePoint around things like content approval. So let me just show you the code very briefly, but what you can see here is this is just a number of web parts that are available that are written in SharePoint Framework that use React as their underlying framework. We looked a little bit at contact management. You can see other parts like, let's say, the time away web part. If I go into the source folder, you'll see all the code for both this sort of time away summary web part and a my time away web part. And then behind the scenes, what you'll see is, there's a number of different components for implementing the outer container of that summary web part, the day, the list, and the week. So all of this code, is implemented in React. We, try to implement it in a robust way, and it's available for you to download and sort of use as your starter pattern. So if you're interested in sort of seeing how these applications are put together, we'll share the link, and you can go download them and take a look and give us feedback. And if you're looking to use them, you'll probably find issues, and we'll sort of take a look at those as well. Okay, let's see. Although they're open source projects, so obviously no support, but they're samples, but we're sort of looking to sort of make them more robust over time. Okay. So that was just a kind of a whirlwind tour of all the different types of applications and some of the patterns and sort of ingredients that we see going into people's applications. We talked about ways to use multiple different lists to kind of pull together and implement a backing application, how you can layer on things like Microsoft Flow to sort of add custom notifications, how you can have code that implements the ability to display custom fields. If you have your own solutions, you can go upload them to make pull requests against this GitHub repository. As I mentioned, there's Shire. Shire is a great company that's got a lot of really solid talent building great web parts, and they're actually looking to make open source some additional portal web parts that will show up inside of the repository soon. And we hope that over time, like a lot of the patterns and practices projects, you will see a lot of interesting applications that you can also draw from when you're building out your own applications. So hopefully you're sort of inspired to go build more business applications on SharePoint to leverage all of the ingredients that SharePoint comes with, to leverage all the different developer APIs, but also the underlying backing SharePoint capabilities to build very solid, tailorable business applications, and then work with the community to submit new solutions so that we can build a better ecosystem. So with that, you can learn more on dev.office.com. All of our developer documentation you can access from dev.office.com/SharePoint. You can go visit the Community Solutions repo. It's github.com/SharePoint, and you'll find it from there. And in addition, we also have a couple of events. We have an upcoming hackathon, and we also have a developer bootcamp, set of developer bootcamp events that are available, over the coming months all around the world. So with that, thank you very much. This is sort of an experimental session about SharePoint solutions, and appreciate your feedback. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you. Questions? No? I'll be up after, so. Yeah, question? Yeah. Yeah. So that's a great question. So the question is what happens if, a flow is created by a person, but the person leaves an organization? What happens to that particular flow? I mean, I don't know the answer to that one. What does exist is this concept of team flows. And with team flows, you can actually have multiple owners so that if a person leaves, that there's other people who are sort of in the team that have created the flow who can then go, sort of take ownership of that. For the specific question, if an individual user creates a flow and they leave, I don't know the answer specifically, and I can get you that one particularly. All right, thanks. So the question was, with this particular piece of code, can we actually run the functions under a different context, like impersonating a user? I don't believe that facility is available yet, but that's something that we'd be looking towards. Of course, you can write your own custom functions that integrate with Flow, and those could, impersonate a different context, but I don't think there's a native capability to that.
That would be critical for these kind of applications where you don't want users to see some pieces of information.
Right. Right. Yeah. For storing data, again, you could do things like custom functions and things like that, but the sort of native ability, that's not quite there, as I know.
Can we then trigger these particular functions from the code right now?
Can you trigger functions from the code? There's ways to build custom triggers. Of course, an easy way to sort of trigger these flows is simply to tie them to a SharePoint list item, then update some data in the SharePoint list item, which would then in turn sort of trigger a flow. So you can either trigger it explicitly with a custom function, or you can actually update a list item to sort of trigger a flow.
Your function has a trigger for the list item?
Yeah. You can connect to Flow directly from your Azure function to sort of start a trigger. You wouldn't necessarily go through a SharePoint list item in that case. Yeah. Thanks.